Welcome back. We've written quite a few tests now, and 13 tests, that's not bad for a small app. There's definitely more that we can do. But I want to cover the last part now that I think is important, and that is testing our actions. Now, you might be asking yourself, what about constants? Are we not testing the constants file? But you can see here that constants are just simply, just assigning string constants to a variable. And when you're testing, you really want to decide for yourself what you need to test and what you don't. With testing, you can really get into a rabbit hole. That is, you just keep working on tests, and next thing you know, you haven't really done anything on the production side of things. And tests are important, but you really want to avoid the idea that, I just need to have 100 pass tests or 100 snapshots, or I need my code coverage to be 100%. It's actually not a good idea to have 100% code coverage because it means that you're running tests that most likely don't need to be run, and your time could have been spent wisely in other areas of your app. Remember, there's infinite things that we can do to refactor, make our code prettier, write more tests, but we have limited time. So as a senior developer, you have to decide for yourself where the trade-offs are. All right, so constants file, we don't really need tests for that. But actions, I think we do need some tests for our actions. Let's create an action or actions.test file. And within here, let's once again import star as actions from our actions file. And with the first action that we have, which is the set search field, that's a pretty simple one. We just want to make sure that this function returns this object. So we can just use basic just functionality here. We can just have the it. And I know I should be using the describe to separate out the two actions that we have, but I think you get the idea. You can do that on your own. I don't want to get you too bored here. Let's have it should create an action to search robots. And this is going to have a very simple text. Let's have a const.text that's going to equal our search term. Woo. And the const, let's have the expected action. And the expected action is going to be our object of type. And let's import our constants here as well, so we can use them. It's going to have a type of change search field and a payload. And this is the expected action. So we expect that the action is going to include the woo text, or we don't need the string characters here. There you go. So we can simply just say expect actions dot search. What was it? It was set search field. Let's copy that. Set search field to have the text and to have to equal. So we want to set the search field with that text, and we need it to have the expected output of the action. So expected action. Let's save. And what did I miss here? Let's see. Nope, no comma here. Now I'm overusing the commas. This test section has been hard on me with the commas. All right, so there you go. We have a new test now in the actions that is passing. Very, very nice. And that's simple. We should know how to do that. But here's the challenging part now. We have this action, request robots, that, oh boy, does a dispatch, and I have an API call here. And this is something that you might not have seen, I've created an API folder here that simply extracts out our fetch call. So we give it a URL and does the response.json, so that it simplifies things for us, so we don't have to constantly do fetch.then response.json. But you've seen this before. Where is it? The actions just have the dispatch of request robots pending, and then finally it's going to have either success or failed. So how do we do this? Because looking at this action, we need dispatch, because this is an asynchronous action. And remember, we need Thunk for it. We need a Thunk middleware. Let's start writing the test and see what we can improve on. I'm going to close some of these tabs just to clean things out. There you go. And we're going to create a new if block. And in this if block, we want to say handles changing, or handles requesting robots API. And we'll say here that, well, the very first thing we want to do, we need to pass the dispatch to our function. Again, remember the dispatch here. Well, if we do it without this, so let's just test it out. If I run the expect actions.request robots action, I believe that's what it's called, yeah, request robots, and we leave it at this, and let's just say that we expect the type of the action to have the, let's say, request robots pending, and payload, if we look at our actions, we're not sending any payloads. So we can just go ahead and leave that as it is. If I save, we get one failed. Oh, request robots. And there you go. I get an error. Type error dispatch is not a function. Because remember, with asynchronous code, we need to pass this dispatch function to actually run this. And we used Thunk middleware in order for us to do this. If you remember index.js, we have the Thunk middleware in here. How do we do this? Well, there's a special package that we can use here. Let me exit out of this. Make this a little bit bigger. Let's clear. We can install a package called the Redux mock store. And remember that this gives us access to a fake store that we can use for testing. So let's do npm install --save dev. And now we have access to this fake store. And the way we can use it is if I go up here and I say import configure store, and once again, this is all in their documentation for the package. We want to use the Redux mock store. And we also want to import the Thunk middleware from the Redux Thunk package, which, if you remember, we already have in our index.js file. And the last thing we need to do, let me make sure it's lined up properly, is to configure and create this store. So we can simply just say const mock store equals configure mock store, and we configure it by giving it some properties, of which one of them is the middleware that we're going to use, which is going to be the Thunk middleware. So sometimes you're most likely going to add this in a setup test file. For now, I'm going to keep it in here because we only have one actions file. But you can usually export it so this store is available to all your tests. So now we can create the store equals to the mock store, and we run it. And I can now say store.dispatch. And store.dispatch takes actions.request robots. So we're going to dispatch this action. Remember, that's this action over here. And once we dispatch that, we can do something like const action equals to store.getActions. And now this action is going to contain what we need. Let me just console log it to show you. So console.log action. It's going to contain the action. Let's save and run npm test. Scroll up, and I have a bit of a console log error here. The configure mock store should be configure mock store here. All right, so we see that dispatch is not a function. Now, why is that? And this is something that you may have noticed while we were looking at the action.js file. You remember that Redux Thunk expects a function to be returned. And although our program works the way it is now, you ideally want to, let's go back to the app.js. You see here that, and this is something we talked about before in the Redux section, you see here that we're just giving the dispatch to our request robots. But the way Thunk works is we want to make sure that we dispatch like this. Run the function inside of it so that we can run the dispatch function just like we have in our tests over here in the actions request robots, and we want to dispatch that. Otherwise, we would have to do store.dispatch in here, which is kind of ugly. Once again, to fix that, all we need to do is in the actions, because if you remember app.js, we have dispatch now, and request robots needs to run. So we're just going to have a function inside of a function. And we want to make sure that this works as well. So I'm going to go back and do npm start. All right, and everything still works. But now we're able to hopefully run the tests better. So npm test, go back to our tests, and we see that we have one failed file. We have a type request robots pending that we expected, but we got a function instead. And if we log actions, we see that we have a action type of request robots pending, which we're getting. And that's because you can see that the action is returning an array, and we want the object of the action. In the expect, because we no longer need to run this action, it's all being run up here, and we can get the actions. We can just say expect action, the first item in the array, to be run. And look at that, everything works. And I know this can get a little bit confusing. And anytime you're testing asynchronous things, it can get pretty difficult. But all we did was really create a fake store that had the Thunk middleware, so it waits for any functions that are returned from an action. in which case we did with our actions.requestRobots, because you see here that it returns an action that takes the dispatch. And now this dispatch gets automatically sent into requestRobots. It's going to receive the actions. And because if we go to our action.js, the very first thing we dispatch is the pending action, we receive action 0 to equal the expected action of robots pending. All right, so how do we test the request robot success and request robots failed? And that's a little challenge that I'm going to leave for you to decide what to do based on what we've learned about asynchronous tests and also what we've learned about mocking our Redux store. And this is a tough, challenging problem. So use whatever resources you have at hand, internet, Google, Stack Overflow, anything you can to try and figure this out. Because that's what testing's all about. Testing is sometimes very simple when you have pure functional components or functions, or it could be really difficult when you have all these dependencies that your tests run on. But every situation is different, and luckily for us, with all these resources online, you can figure it out as long as you understand how things work and what the errors mean, which as a senior developer is the most important thing. They don't know every single syntax in a library and know all the documentation. They just understand how things work underneath the hood so that when the problem arises, they can solve it. Finally, I wanted to show you two things that may help you or I think are great whenever you're doing asynchronous tests. The first one is a library called Nock. And Nock simply is an npm package that you can install, and you can see over here that we can pretend that we're doing a URL call. We can do a GET request to an endpoint, and we can automatically reply with whatever we want. We can say that this reply had a status of 200, and it gave us username and an email. And this sets you up really nicely for asynchronous tests. Once you get deep into testing as well, especially when you start working with APIs, Supertest is one of my favorite tools. Simply by importing Supertest, just like here, and we have the request, you can request, let's say, an Express app, and you can do all these things like running GET and expecting a content type and a status and a ton of things. Now, this is beyond the scope of this course, and it's something that you can take a look at as you get more and more into testing. But just realize that there's tons of tools out there for you to use to write clean, nice, beautiful tests. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.